All right, everyone. I'm going to look in this lecture. I was going to handle a whole series of Lewis's essays in the lecture. First of all, let me begin by saying. And then when I sought to sit down and to try and do that, I found that I was incapable, even in my own mind, of doing any justice to several short essays in one lecture because of the substance that I thought was contained in any single one lecture. And in particular, the one that I'm going to look at here this morning, which is Lewis's essay, The Weight of Glory. Now, when I say it's an essay, let me also add to that it was not originally presented in such a form. It was delivered as a sermon. And it was a sermon that was delivered at the 12th century church right on in Oxford, in the University Church at St. Mary's, St. Mary the Virgin, delivered on the 8th of June, 1941, and apparently with a very large congregation assembled. So right in the middle of wartime, the Second World War. And he had been invited to give this sermon by the canon of the cathedral there, Canon Milford, who had read Lewis's The Pilgrim's Regress and was so intrigued by it that he invited Lewis at that point, dawn of Magdalen College, Oxford, to deliver that address. And then he did. Now, I heard this myself, not that I'm old enough to have heard it in 1941, but I did hear it performed in St. Mary the Virgin, and I can't remember the date exactly, but probably 1995. Is that correct? No, it must have been 2005, by Joss Ackland, who played Lewis in a rendition of the film The Shadowlands, which is about Lewis and his wife, Joy Gresham. And it was magnificent. It's always wonderful when an actor with a good voice and understanding reads something aloud like that. But I am going to look at it, and it's in the estimation of his literary executor, Walter Hooper, this is a work that is so magnificent that he considers it worthy of a place among some of the church fathers, and for which reason he puts it at the outset of an edition of essays that he calls The Weight of Glory, and titles it based on that. So that's Hooper's own estimation of Lewis's work. Lewis himself does not speak of it in such terms, and understandably so, because it was a sermon. Lewis regards his best literary endeavor to be Till We Have Faces, and I concur with his own assessment of his own work. It's not always the case that artists are the best judges of their own work, and nor are critics for that matter, but I happen to think that Lewis is right in this. It's a brilliant work. But I see The Weight of Glory not only as reflecting upon the great themes that we find in Till We Have Faces, which I unfortunately am not looking at on this particular course. I do have on my YouTube channel, I do have videos recorded of my speaking to the themes and the wonderful qualities of Till We Have Faces, but rather in the light of this work or this course on science fiction and sub-creation. And to give some sense of structure to it without just going along through the work itself, although I intend on doing that, and then commenting on and making reference to other works that Lewis is writing that, it seemed to me, hang on the cornerstone of this particular work, The Weight of Glory. There are two themes that I think it addresses, in addition to the ones that it enunciates about the weight of glory. And those two themes are ones that I have mentioned on the course, or at least one of which I've mentioned on the course. And that one is the sense of alienation. of estrangement, of what many these days call disenchantment from the universe, which is a characteristically modern phenomenon, and is to some degree to be situated and identified with the shift in cosmology that we talked about in relation to Lewis's work, The Discarded Image. The discarded image there was, of course, the image of nature, as well as the image of that had been cultivated over the centuries during the medieval period. Christian reflections on the classical inheritance applied and shot through with Christian doctrine. That image and the symbolism attached to the cosmos and to nature had been discarded in favor of an empiricist notion of reality. And concomitant with that, a great deal of the alienation and estrangement and disenchantment ensues. That's my assessment of Lewis's own opinion on that, and also that of Tolkien. They both love the medieval world in part because of its great richness, its great sense of belonging and of purpose and of meaning, even in this world, even insofar as both men recognize that here we have but a foreshadowing of the glory that will come when we see God face to face. We see him now as in a glass darkly, but then face to face, says St. Paul in his first epistle to the Corinthians, chapter 13. But that sense of alienation or estrangement or disenchantment, which is going to be the subject matter of Lewis's science fiction trilogy, and also the subject matter of the little group of addresses that he gave in the midst of that, which are captured in the volume we now call The Abolition of Man, after one of the lectures there, is also attended by another phenomenon, and that is the appearance in the 19th century and thereafter of the great man, so-called, which becomes the subject of much historiography, certainly in the 19th century, and the idea of trying to understand history, human history, in accordance with the work and personage of great men. And the best known exponent of this view is that of Thomas Carlyle here. And I have a volume here which contains some of his works on the subject, but this is entitled Thomas Carlyle on Heroes, Hero Worship, and the Heroic in History. Carlyle was a Victorian writer, poet himself, author of Sartor Resartus, very important, not only in his reflection on German Romanticism, but also as a bridge to the American transcendentalist movement, so Walt Whitman and company here. And he gives a variety of lectures, does Carlyle here, and this is, it's a little aside and I'll go back to our subject matter here, but the lectures are on the hero as divinity, and then he looks at Odin, paganism, and Scandinavian mythology, the hero as prophet, and then he looks at Muhammad and Islam. He looks at the hero as poet, and he looks at Dante and Shakespeare. Lecture 4, he looks at the hero as priest. He looks at Luther, the Reformation, at Knox and Puritanism. Lecture 5, the hero as man of letters. He looks at Johnson, he looks at Rousseau, and he looks at Robbie Burns. And then finally, in the 6th lecture, the hero as king. And interestingly, here does not look at kings per se. He looks at Cromwell, Napoleon, and modern revolutionism. So these are 6 lectures that he gave on the hero and the great man thesis, that namely that what the world requires in order for it to orient itself and to keep itself on a firm foundation, or at least from stumbling into chaos, is a great man. This great man thesis, which is both to be found on the left and the right, which is so alarming. and is so alarming, particularly to Lewis in his own day, in the form of the great, so-called great men that have arisen in his presence, men such as Adolf Hitler, who Lewis, as all right-thinking people do, regard as a tyrant and as a great curse on mankind. Similarly, the contemporaries would regard Napoleon in the same way. I know that Thomas Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge regarded him in quasi-satanic terms. But that takes us a little bit away from my subject here. But I will return to that theme of heroes and the need for a great man towards the end of the lecture on this, and it'll become apparent why I have regarded that as a second point against which we need to see both Lewis and Tolkien's work. So the sense of estrangement, alienation, disenchantment on the one hand, and also the danger and the allure of the great man. The great man, the great figure, whether it's a Saruman, a Sauron the Great, or any other figure like that. So images of pride. But let's go to the weight of glory. And with it, this theme of alienation. And I mentioned in a previous class, I've mentioned it many times in many different classes, but I don't think it can be said too often, that it is salutary to note that in literature of the 19th century and onwards, the most common heroes presented in fiction are often orphans. And when I say often, they're almost without exception orphans. And I won't go through a lengthy list here. You can think about it just for yourself. And with that comes the question why it should be the case that what in the ancient world, and for that matter in Christianity, is regarded as a most pitiable state, that of being an orphan, is presented in the modern period, post-romantic, as a state of heroism to be emulated and followed. And one of the reasons that I give is simply that the orphan has no natural attachment, has no inheritance to lean on. There's nothing worldly. The orphan is, in a sense, a fit symbol for progress. No attachment to the past. In and of himself, he will invent his own identity, create his identity, in the process that the Germans in their educational paradigm call Bildung, B-I-L-D-U-N-G, and a word that's difficult to translate into English, but it is often presented in terms of self-cultivation. And I say this because education, of course, is part of the paradigm here that Lewis himself will be coming to address in The Abolition of Man, that great theme of modern education and how it deviates from the path of education that had been true of mankind from time immemorial. But Bildung, self-cultivation, which we see in the Bildungsroman, it's a type of novel, and we could see in some ways Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as this sort of Bildungsroman, written in such terms, in which a figure raises himself, educates himself, makes himself a hero for us to emulate or model, and Shelley both presents that in the form of the scientist and at the same time questions how exactly heroic this model of heroism is. Lewis is addressing those very same things, but he does so as a medievalist, and he does so with a very different assessment of its goodness. And to say very different is an understatement. I would say with a contrary sense of its goodness. And in fact, he will see it as a spirit of malevolence. And the weight of glory is attached to these observations. And he begins with an interesting gambit, and he does what he often does in his essays, which is begin by giving a little example. Exordium is what it's called in classical scholarship. It draws the reader in, and the exordium here is: if you asked 20 good men today what they thought the highest of the virtues, 19 of them would reply, unselfishness. Remember, it's wartime when he's writing this. It's being willing to sacrifice one's own desires for the common good. That's what's being called upon his fellow Englishmen at this time. It's what we're being called upon to do during lockdown, during COVID lockdown. We are to remember the common good and to put our own needs aside. So unselfishness. And Lewis notes here that this is, even in its form, in its linguistic expression, a negation. It's a very negative thing. What we are being called upon to be virtuous is to not do something. And Lewis notes that, historically speaking, from a Christian point of view, this would be unrecognizable, indeed nonsensical. The greatest virtue, which St. Paul mentions in his, again, the first letter to the Corinthians, and the hallmark of Augustinian theology, is the virtue of love. The greatest of these is love. Faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love, says St. Paul. In the understanding of the 7 cardinal virtues, or the 7 great virtues in medieval philosophy, again, these are the 3 theological virtues that are on top of the 4 cardinal virtues of justice and prudence and wisdom and temperance. But love would be the one thing that would be the highest virtue, but not recognized as such in our day. So there's this opening gambit. And he says, you see what's happened, a negative is replaced a positive. Okay, with that begins his essay. And he says that the contemporary call to self-denial, unselfishness, is not in any way a fair reflection of the greatest virtue. In fact, abstemiousness, in some sense, presents virtue in a cold, disenchanted, self-denying, alienating thing. And it's one of the interesting features of modern life that the more collective its mindset and its actions are, the more shallow and tortured its existence is. And this is the product of the fiction of the 20th century, this sense of alienation. It's there in the nihilistic fiction of Sartre and others. The sense of alienation we find also in Kafka in his fiction. But he says that the Christian virtue of love is something altogether different and altogether more glorious, altogether more weighty. He acknowledges that the New Testament has a lot to say about self-denial, but not as an end in itself. And this is important. And it will be the subject of one of his pertinent observations also when he talks about equality. Equality as something that is medicine, but not food. Equality is a good thing to blunt the attempts of the so-called great men around us who want us to worship them. And we will appeal to the idea of equality, that we are equally made in the image of God, and that will prevent them from oppressing us. In that sense, equality is a good thing, but it's not the ultimate thing. Equality is there simply to prevent atrocities, but it's not the end of life. The end of life is the food, the meat and drink of life. And that is only captured in this word, love. So when he says that that the sense of unselfishness has crept in, he thinks it's come in through writers like Immanuel Kant and his ethics, and it's stoical in its historical pedigree, and he says it has no part in the Christian faith. So the idea of denying yourself is a beginning point, but it's not the end point. It's not the ultimate goal. And he said, if we really thought about it, the real problem with us is not that we're selfish. It's that we're not selfish enough. It's an extraordinary twist that he presents on this. But what does he mean by this? He said, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition, when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased, Lewis's assessment. This great theme, then, is the one that arises out of here. So the backdrop is that of estrangement and alienation, and of being robbed of something essential. What Lewis's fiction, on the other hand, draws us towards is what in the great German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe calls selige Sehnsucht, the blessed longings, the desires, and whither they tend. And the whither towards which they tend is that of glory, and the glory of heaven. And he says that to a Christian audience when he's delivering the sermon, we must not be troubled by unbelievers when they say that this promise of reward makes the Christian life a mercenary affair. Although very rarely do we actually hear that from unbelievers, because all too often Christians don't speak of the rewards of heaven anymore. They're all too earthly and too committed to social justice and political causes these days. So all too rarely do we actually hear Christians speaking of the glory of heaven and the weight of glory and the promises given by God when we will see him face to face. But he notes that there is the reward that has no natural connection with the things you do to earn it, and is quite foreign to the desires that ought to accompany those things. And so then he does what he often does so well. He gives us a couple of analogies of what he might mean here. So money, he says, is not the natural reward of love, which is why we call a man a mercenary if he marries a woman for the sake of her money. But marriage is the proper reward of the real lover, he notes. And he is not mercenary for desiring it, to be married. A general who fights well in order to get a peerage, that is, to get a title, is mercenary. He does as a means to the end of a title, but he doesn't do it for the sake of the thing itself. But a general who fights for victory is not. Victory being the proper reward of battle, as marriage is the proper reward of love. So remember, it's not just the means to some other thing, it's pursuing things as ends in themselves and delighting in those things. That's his point here. The proper rewards are not simply tacked on to the activity for which they are given, but are the activity itself in consummation. Now that's his opening gambit here. and so not to confuse means with ends, or be distracted by something other than that. And I'm minded when I read this of Augustine when he uses a similar such analogy at the outset of his treatise on education, De Doctrina Christiana, in which he talks about our life being a journey, and a journey which has a goal. And if we are distracted in our journey and get satisfied in the things along the journey, then we never reach the true goal. So there's an orientation of our loves. And it seems to me Lewis, when he is speaking in this great sermon, The Weight of Glory, is thinking in Augustinian terms. Everything is oriented by love, which is Lewis's themes here as much as it is Dante's in his literary corpus, for that matter. And I would say, for that matter, is also that of Milton. I see both men, both the great Dante and the great Milton, motivated by the theme of love. And we could throw in with that Shakespeare, but let's not get ourselves distracted here. But he says there's also a third case, and this is a little bit more complicated, and the complication is important here. And I will read here from the essay. An enjoyment of Greek poetry is certainly a proper and not a mercenary reward for learning Greek. But only those who have reached the stage of enjoying Greek poetry can tell from their own experience that this is so. The schoolboy learning Greek grammar cannot look forward to his adult enjoyment of Sophocles as a lover looks forward to marriage or a general to victory. He has to begin by working for marks, or to escape punishment, or to please his parents, or at best in the hope of a future good, which he cannot at present imagine or desire. His position, therefore, bears a certain resemblance to that of the mercenary. The reward he is going to get will, in actual fact, be a natural or proper reward, but he will not know that till he has got it. Of course, he gets it gradually. Enjoyment creeps in upon the mere drudgery, and nobody could point to a day or an hour when the one ceased and the other began. But it is just insofar as he approaches the reward that he becomes able to desire it for its own sake. Indeed, the power of so desiring is itself a preliminary award. The Christian, in relation to heaven, is in much the same position as this schoolboy. Now, this is a fascinating thing, a fascinating analogy, and this is typical of Lewis's genius, is his capacity for drawing apt analogies and helping us to think and see through the eyes of faith rightly. He goes on, those who have attained everlasting life in the vision of God doubtless know very well that it is no mere bribe, but the very consummation of their earthly discipleship. But we who have not yet attained it cannot know this in the same way, and cannot even begin to know it at all, except by continuing to obey and finding the first reward of our obedience in our increasing power to desire the ultimate reward. Just in proportion as the desire grows, our fear lest it should be a mercenary desire will die away and finally be recognized as an absurdity. But probably this will not, for most of us, happen in a day. Poetry replaces grammar. Gospel replaces law. Longing transforms obedience as gradually as the tide lifts a grounded ship. But there's one more important similarity between the schoolboy and ourselves. If he is an imaginative boy, he will quite probably be reveling in the English poets and romancers suitable to his age, sometime before he begins to suspect that Greek grammar is going to lead him to more and more enjoyments of this same sort. He may even be neglecting his Greek to read Shelley and Swinburne in secret. In other words, the desire which Greek is really going to gratify already exists in him and is attached to objects which seem to him quite unconnected with Xenophon and the verbs in Greek. Now, if we are made for heaven, the desire for our proper place will be already in us, but not yet attached to the true object, and will even appear as the rival of that object. And this, I think, is just what we find. And this is where the analogy with the schoolboy breaks down. But it's a fit analogy. Now, contemporary application here. Why is it that children in schools are bored with their studies? Why is it that they are attracted to video games, into various forms of fantasy? Note that the fantasies are often attached now to superheroes and such thing. And those forms, and often interestingly to fictional worlds and so forth. And it's exactly for the reason that Lewis mentions here. There's a longing for a sense of meaning and purpose and glory in these stories. However badly, in my assessment, they are presented, nonetheless, it's there, and the children gravitate towards that and not to what is being taught to them. Now, why is that? Well, in part, it's because nothing is being taught to them of substance. That will be the latter, the grammar stage, that will lead them to question in the logic stage of their education, to appreciate the flourishing that arises out of their knowledge of Greek grammar, Latin grammar, or the grammar of any subject. The flower they're not even getting in the roots, because they're already being told that they should direct their own education, that their own desires should lead them to what they want in life. And child-centered learning is the dictum in the school system, rather than exactly what Lewis is prescribing here, that there is a necessary path of obedience and knowledge that will lead to higher forms of knowledge. there is no such thing in the education system, and no sense of purpose or meaning in it, because the child is already being told you ought to direct your own education. All you have to do here in the class is sit and be quiet and be a good citizen, in the sense of deny yourself. That's not good enough for children. That makes them, as Lewis says in The Abolition of Man, into deserts that need to be cultivated and fertilized and watered. And that's what he finds in his own students. Even back in the 1940s, when he writes that wonderful work, The Abolition of Man. But he says that this longing for, and this desire for an undiscovered country, he says we find this in ourselves at all times. Lewis is speaking of his own experience, but also as an educator and as a man who simply is vastly acquainted with the literary endeavors of past ages, that there is in this sense of longing for a country, a far-off country, an undiscovered country. He sees it in the great literary endeavors of the past and in his own heart. And he says that he's almost shy about it. He says that I am almost committing an indecency when he does this. He's not denying himself, he's indulging himself, he's fantasizing, he's dreaming of something greater than any earthly object can meet. And he says, I'm trying to rip open the inconsolable secret in each one of us, in each one of you, the secret which hurts so much that you take your revenge on it by calling it names like nostalgia and romanticism and adolescence. Nostalgia, the word in Greek containing two words, nostos, which is the return home, and algia, from which we get pain. Neuralgics are ones that dull neural pain, and sort of analgesics are painkillers. Nostalgia is the pain that we get at returning home, the sense of longing or aching for a home that is not currently our home, a better home than the home in which we currently inhabit. And we call it these names because there's a sense of aching and pain that goes with that. Now, he says Wordsworth identifies this in his own past. Those blessed moments in his youth, which he calls spots of time, in which there's a sense of heaven in his youth, which he can't recapture other than imaginatively, but he only locates them in the past. And he says, Lewis says, comments, this is a cheat. If Wordsworth had gone back to those moments in the past, he would not have found the thing itself, but only the reminder of it. And what he remembered would turn out to be itself a remembering. So the books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them. It was not in them, it came only through them. And what came through them was longing. These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, are good images that of what we really desire. But if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn out into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshippers. So when we're nostalgic about the past, about our own experiences, or of a past age, we, first of all, it's not just nostalgia, it is to some degree a fictional creation. The old days weren't always quite so good as we would like them to see through the rose-colored spectacles of our age. And it would turn out to be a dumb idol, and it would in fact break our hearts. But there was something good there, and it was a premonition of a greatness and a good which Lewis says is met, ideally met, perfectly met in the form of heaven. And that weight of glory is laid on our hearts, and it directs our whole beings. Now, in the Westminster Shorter Catechism, it asks the question, what is the chief end of man? And it answers that question by, it is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. That sense of, that same sense there is right at the introduction of the Westminster Shorter Catechism, also here expressed in Lewis's works in terms of this longing for God. So he says, they are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited. Do you think I'm trying to weave a spell? Perhaps I am. And now here comes this wonderful introduction of a theme here. He is trying to weave a spell. A spell. A spell is a word in Anglo-Saxon. A spell is a word or a story, but it's also an enchantment. He says spells are used for breaking. Remember your fairy stories? Spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as for inducing them. And you and I have need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness, which has been laid upon us for nearly 100 years. Nearly 100 years. He's writing this in the 1940s. And the sense of the worldliness here is not worldliness in the sense of a worldliness that anticipates the weight of glory, but a worldliness that's disenchanted and is thin and shallow and shadowy and without substance, without love. That's the thing that he is describing as worldliness here. And he says almost our whole education has been directed to silencing this shy, persistent inner voice. Almost all our modern philosophies have been devised to convince us that the good of man is to be found on this earth. And yet, it is a remarkable thing that such philosophies of progress or creative evolution themselves bear witness to the truth that our real goal is elsewhere. Is progressing towards something. What is the something? It's something that's not yet here. As worldly as they are, as their explanatory premises that everything can be deduced or inferred from nature and everything begins in nature, there's no God, there's no, so creative, everything is natural, and at the same time they're progressing away from that. And therefore they long to be away from the embodied planet of Earth, and they have this sense of disembodiedness, which we noted was characteristic of the sense of self that we find in H.G. Wells' First Men in the Moon. That quasi-Gnostic emancipation from the self, the grandiose spiritual sense. We will find that Lewis also speaks about this in his own fiction. When we come to the Out of the Silent Planet, that's one of the first things he addresses, and we'll draw our attention to that in the lecture that's devoted to that. But he says that when they want to convince you that Earth is your home, notice how they set about it. They begin by trying to persuade you that the Earth can be made into heaven, thus giving a sop to your sense of exile in the earth, on the earth as it is. Next, they tell you that this fortunate event is still a good way off in the future, thus giving you a sop to your knowledge that the fatherland is not here and now. Finally, lest your longing for the trans-temporal should awake and spoil the whole affair, they use any rhetoric that comes to hand to keep out of your mind the recollection that even if all the happiness they promised could come to man on earth, yet still each generation would lose it by death, including the last generation of all. And the whole story would be nothing, not even a story, forever and ever. And thus they explain heat, death, and extinction of things. There will be an annihilation of all life. That same idea is the master narrative of the Green Movement. It's both something that they fear and also long for, and something that they say we are trying to prevent the extinction of all life while at the same time extinguishing life in the name of preserving life. It's that absurd contradiction that we find there in modern progressivism, and connected in particular with the environmental movement as presented today. And lies, perhaps one could argue, behind the so-called Great Reset of our day. But he says, hence, all the nonsense that Mr. Shaw, Bernard Shaw, puts into the final speech of Lilith, and Henri Bergson's remark that the élan vital is capable of surmounting all obstacles, perhaps even death, as if we could believe that any social or biological development on this planet will delay the senility of the sun or reverse the second law of thermodynamics, entropy. things are getting worse and worse, less and less perfect, not more and more, as if we could overturn the laws of physics. So this is fascinating. Fascinating beginnings of this. So he says, do that what you will, we remain conscious of this desire nonetheless. Returns back to his main point. We remain conscious of a desire which no natural happiness will satisfy. But is there any reason to suppose that reality offers any satisfaction to it? Is there any reason for that? And then he quotes an unknown interlocutor here. Nor does the being hungry prove that we have bread. But, I think, he says, it may well be argued that this misses the point. A man's physical hunger does not prove that man will get any bread. He may die of starvation on a raft in the Atlantic. But surely a man's hunger does prove that he comes of a race which repairs its body by eating and inhabits a world where eatable substances exist. In the same way, though I do not believe, I wish I did, that my desire for paradise proves that I shall enjoy it, I think it is a pretty good indication that such a thing exists, and that some men will. A man may love a woman and not win her, but it would be very odd if the phenomenon called falling in love occurred in a sexless world. So here then is the desire, still wandering, uncertain in its object, largely unable to see the object in the direction where it really lies. Now remember, this desire here is like this pupil who is going through things and exercising things, but doesn't know the purpose or end of that, and yet has the desire, this longing within himself, and he's not finding any satisfaction in what he is doing. And what he is doing is living this life in this world, in its myriad of forms. Move away from the analogy of the pupil right now and just think of living life. There is nothing in that experience. Now he says, our sacred books give us some account of the object. It is, of course, a symbolical account, and this is an important point. Symbolism and metaphor and figurative language is necessary to convey theological truth. And if we're going to appeal to simply empirical phenomenon and use the language and the whole intellectual worldview of empiricism, then we're going to miss the point of symbolic language, which is essential to understanding Christian truth, which is what we emphasized in the Bible as literature last semester. He says, heaven is by definition outside our experience, but all intelligible descriptions must be of things within our experience. So here's the paradox. To be intelligible, it has to be something we've experienced. To be true to what we describe as heaven, it has to be outside of our experience. So how do we hold together those two things, that it is something we experience and yet something that we have not ever experienced? Well, it's by means of symbolism, literary language. The scriptural picture of heaven is therefore just as symbolical as the picture which our desire unaided invents for itself. Heaven is not really full of jewelry any more than it's really the beauty of nature or a fine piece of music. The difference is that the scriptural imagery has authority. That's the difference. There is a weight to scripture. It's revelation. And he says, it comes to us from writers who were closer to God than we, and it has stood the test of Christian experience down the centuries. Furthermore, an appeal to experience, it stood the test of the experience of foregoing generations. We don't need to be orphans and lean only on our experience. We can trust the testimony of others. The natural appeal of this authoritative imagery is, to me at first, very small. It chills rather than awakes my desire, and thus it's what I ought to, and that is just what I ought to expect, he says. If Christianity could tell me no more of the far-off land my own temperament led me to surmise already, then Christianity would be no higher than myself. If it has more to give me, I expect it to be less immediately attractive than my own stuff. Sophocles, to go back to his analogy of learning Greek, at first seems dull and cold to the boy who has only reached Shelley. If our religion is something objective, then we must never avert our eyes from those elements in it which seem puzzling or repellent. For it will be precisely the puzzling or the repellent which conceals what we do not yet know and need to know. So now he gets the promises of Scripture, and he gives a synopsis of the promises of Scripture in relation to heaven here, and he numbers them, and it's quite rather helpful for orientation. And there are 5 heads. He says it is promised, firstly, that we shall be with Christ. That's the first promise about heaven. Secondly, that we shall be like him. Thirdly, with an enormous wealth of imagery, that we shall have glory. Fourthly, that we shall in some sense be fed or feasted or entertained. And fifthly, that we shall have some sort of official position in the universe, ruling elites, ruling cities, judging angels, being pillars of God's temple. So the first question he asks here, and I think it's an interesting question, is why any of them, other than the first, will be with God? What's with all the other ones? Can anything be added to being with Christ? For it must be true, as an old writer says, he notes, that he who has God and everything else has no more than he who has God only. And he says, I think the answer turns again on the nature of symbols. What do we mean by symbols? What's the nature of symbols? Though it may escape our notice at first glance, yet it is true that any conception of being with Christ, which most of us can now form, will not be very much less symbolical than the other promises. For it will smuggle in ideas of proximity in space and loving conversation as we now understand conversation. So when we think of being with Christ, we think with in proximate terms, in terms of space and time, because we consider everything in terms of space and time. And we think of a person and what we do with other persons, and we think of conversation then, and we will probably concentrate on the humanity of Christ. And he says, and the problem with that is we exclude the other aspect of Christ, which we acknowledge by faith, and that is that he is also God. He's both man and God. And so we exclude the divinity when we consider being with Christ. And in fact, we find that those Christians who attend solely to his first promise always do fill it up with very earthly imagery indeed. In fact, with hymnal or erotic imagery. And there's a great mystical tradition of doing precisely that thing. Think of Christ as a lover. Julian of Norwich and so forth, or Margaret of Kempe, mystics of the medieval period. And he says, I'm not concentrating on such imagery at the moment, and he wished he could enter it more deeply than I do, so it's not, and pray that he yet shall. But he says, his point is that it is only a symbol. To be with God is a symbol, like the reality in some respects, but unlike it in others, and therefore needs correction from the different symbols in the other promises. So the other 4 promises flesh out the symbolism entailed in the first one. So the variation of the promises does not mean that anything other than God will be our ultimate bliss. So being a pillar, or being fed or feasted or entertained, that's not meant to replace the primary symbolic image. It's to elucidate them, to expand upon them, to give them a sense of substance and intention there. So the variation of the promises does not mean that anything other than God will be our ultimate bliss, but because God is more than a human person, unless we should imagine the joy of his presence too exclusively in terms of our present poor experience of personal love, with all of its narrowness and strain and monotony, a dozen changing images, correcting and relieving each other, are supplied. That's his explanation for it. I think it's a very good one. It's a very good one. So he turns to this idea of glory. Now, glory is presented in various terms. Salvation with palms and crowns and white robes and thrones, and splendor being like the sun and the stars. And he says, these things make no appeal to me at all, not immediately. But he says that that's probably because he's a modern. Lewis himself, just like me. We are moderns, and we don't value those sorts of trappings of palms and crowns and robes and thrones and splendor and so forth. These are a pagan culture where they seemingly do glory in these things. But he says there are 2 ideas of glory as a modern man that immediately come to him, and one of them seems wicked and the other seems ridiculous. Wicked insofar as it suggests fame and pride. Ridiculous in the sense as it suggests luminosity, like brightness. I'm going to be glowing, shining. As for the first, since to be famous means to be better known than other people, the desire for fame appears to me to a competitive passion, and therefore of hell rather than heaven. The product of the devil, of pride, who set himself above others. And for the second, who wants to be a living electric light bulb, he says. But then he looks at Christians and his forebears like Milton and Johnson and Thomas Aquinas, and they take heavenly glory rather in the sense of fame or good report. And that's interesting. The well done, good and faithful servant. In that sense, it's God's praise. And he says it's very interesting that how much a child delights in his father's praise or his mother's praise or a figure of authority in the praise of a good assessment. And in that sense of a good favor and a good assessment, that in that sense, glory seems to be right. And he says that this is a very humble thing. We are being praised by our infinite superior and being given nonetheless a true assessment of true praise. And this is really fascinating, his assessment here. So he says, perfect humility dispenses with modesty. If God is satisfied with the work may be satisfied with itself. It is not for her to bandy compliments with her sovereign. If God says, well done and good and faithful servant, and that is glory, which it is, then this is something earnestly to be longed for. So he said he read in a periodical the other day, and this is an interesting angle on this. He says that the fundamental thing is how we think of God. Lewis, as usual, takes issue with this. He says, by God himself, it is not. How God thinks of us is not only more important, but infinitely more important. Indeed, how we think of him is of no importance, except insofar as it related to how he thinks of us. So we're going to stand before him, it says in Scripture, and shall be inspected, shall be scrutinized, shall be judged. The promise of glory is the promise almost incredible and only possible by the work of Christ, by his imputed righteousness, by his praise, that some of us, that any of us who really chooses, shall actually survive that examination, shall find approval, shall please God. To please God, to be a real ingredient in the divine happiness, to be loved by God, not merely pitied, but delighted in, as an artist delights in his work or a father in his son, it seems impossible. A weight or a burden of glory which our thoughts can hardly sustain, but so it is, he says. Now, it's really interesting, and he doesn't make this analogy, it's just my analogy now and my thought. It's fascinating to see how many people are caught up in addictions and abusive personal behavior through adherence to selfishness and the longing for something outside their selfishness. So they're thrown by the modern image of the orphan into accepting no authority over themselves and being their own guiding light. At the same time, they long for approval and they seek it and they demand it, and they are seeking for a substitute for heaven, and they find it in terms of drugs or in terms of relationships which end up being abusive, sometimes because someone is looking to abuse them, but other times simply because any relationship which is not ultimately related to God is going to end up being what he earlier Lewis calls an idol, and therefore ipso facto a delusion and hurtful, and therefore abusive of our essential longings and desires that he says orientate themselves in their ultimate sense towards God. And he says, now notice what's happening. If I had rejected the authoritative and scriptural image of glory and stuck to the vague desire which was, at the outset, my only pointer to heaven, I could not have no connection between that desire and the Christian promise. But now, having followed up what seemed puzzling and repellent in the sacred books, I find to my great surprise, looking back, that the connection is perfectly clear. Glory, as Christianity teaches me to hope for, turns out to be to satisfy my original desire, and indeed to reveal an element in the desire which I had not noticed. By ceasing for a moment to consider my own wants, I have begun to learn better what I really wanted. So by not being the orphan, by not being selfish, by not worshiping heroes, by not wanting to be a hero or a superhero, those things, by considering, ceasing to consider my own wants, but considering another and putting that other ahead of myself. When I attempted a few minutes ago to describe our spiritual longings, Lewis says, I was omitting one of their most curious characteristics. We usually notice it just as the moment of a vision dies away. As the music ends or a landscape loses the celestial light, what we feel then has been well described by Keats as the journey homeward to habitual self. What is this? For a few minutes, we had the illusion of belonging to that world when we're reading a book, when we're listening to a wonderful piece of music, when we are beholding in a romance, a love scene between a Romeo and a Juliet. We're caught up in that world. When we're reading the stories of Lewis and Tolkien, for that matter, we are lost in that tale, and then we return to our habitual self. And we awake to find that there is no such thing. We've been mere spectators. Beauty has smiled, but not to welcome us. Her face was turned in our direction, but not to see us. We have not been accepted, welcomed, or taken into the dance. Nobody marks us. Nobody pays attention. They don't even notice that we're there. A scientist may reply that since most of the things we call beautiful are inanimate, it's not very surprising that they take no notice of us. And that, of course, is true. But it is not the physical objects that I'm speaking of, but that indescribable something of which they become, for a moment, the messengers. And part of the bitterness which mixes with the sweetness of that message is due to the fact that it is so seldom. It seldom seems to be a message intended for us, but rather something we have overheard. And by bitterness, I mean pain, not resentment. There's a beauty there that we desire, but the beauty is not intended for us. And this leads to this sense of bitterness. We haven't been noticed by beauty, and we long to be accepted by beauty, to be included in beauty. This desire for the ultimately desirable, which beauty is a symbol of and is a representation of, which is a figure of. And these things are the things that we not only want to notice, but be noticed by. It's the longing of the lover for the beloved and the beloved of the lover. And St. Paul, he said, goes on to say, promises to those who love God, not, as we would expect, that they will know him, but rather that they will be known by him. 1 Corinthians 8, verse 3. It's a very strange promise. Why does he invert it? Well, does not God not know all things at all times? Well, yes, but it is dreadfully re-echoed this same sense in another passage of the New Testament. There he says, we are warned that it may happen to any one of us who appear at last before the face of God and hear only the appalling words, I never knew you, depart from me. In some sense, Lewis comments, as dark to the intellect as it is unendurable to the feelings, we can be both banished from the presence of him who is present everywhere and erased from the knowledge of him who knows all. So to be known by God is to belong to him. And if we claim to know him, but he doesn't know us, we can be left utterly and absolutely outside, repelled, exiled, estranged, finally, and unspeakably ignored. On the other hand, we can be called in, welcomed, received, acknowledged. We walk every day on the razor edge between these two incredible possibilities. He talks about this and expands on it in his work, The Great Divorce. He will talk about it in his discussion, Lewis, of Perelandra and the longing for the lady, and the lady, which is just a foreshadowing of love. This whole dynamic there, and the longing that he speaks of in reflection upon Narnia. And the reason we love so there's this world, there's Narnia, which is a fictional world, and then there's what Narnia connotes, which is the undiscovered country. And the children at the end of Narnia are called to go further up and further in. That story, which is a symbol of heavenly goods, of heavenly virtues being played out in corporeal form, is nonetheless a foreshadowing a dim and shallow foretasting of the true and glorious food and the true and glorious relationship in which we not only see God, but are seen by God, in which we not only know God, but are known by him. And so this sense of brightness and splendor and luminosity, which ends up being the substance of the rest of this essay, he says, we want something more than mere aesthetics books speak of. We do not merely want to see beauty, although beauty is wonderful enough and is far too little the part of modern art or modern literature or modern life. He says we want something else which we can hardly put into words, to be united with the beauty we see, to pass into it, to receive it into ourselves, to bathe in it, to become a part of it. We become united with God. And union with Christ is one of the great themes of Scripture. We become one with God. We are in Christ. We are in his temple. We are in his presence. So there's a unity there. And not just with the human Christ, but with the deity, with God himself in his great, to our current sight, impenetrable glory. And he says, that is why we have peopled, and he's now going to talk about fiction and symbols and of nature and so forth. He says, that is why we, the poets, have peopled air and earth and water with gods and goddesses and nymphs and elves. That though we cannot, yet these projections can enjoy in themselves that beauty, grace, and power of which nature is the image. So nature is the image, but it's an image of a glory that is peopled there with fictional beings of the sort that we find in the fantasy works of Lewis and Tolkien, that themselves suggest a glory that's far more glorious than the glory of which these things themselves represent. And he says, that's why the poets tell us such lovely falsehoods. They talk as if the west wind could really sweep into a human soul, but it can't. They tell us that the beauty born of murmuring sound will pass into a human face, but it won't, or not yet. For if we take the imagery of Scripture seriously, if we believe that God will one day give us the morning star and cause us to put on the splendor of the sun, then we may surmise that both the ancient myths and the modern poetry, so false as history, may be very near the truth as prophecy. At the present, we are on the outside of the world, the wrong side of the door, the wrong side of the wardrobe. We discern the freshness and the purity of the morning, but they do not make us fresh and pure. We cannot mingle with the splendors we see. But all the leaves of the New Testament are rustling with the rumor that it will not always be so. Someday, God willing, we shall get in. When human souls have become as perfect in voluntary obedience as the inanimate creation is in its lifeless obedience, then they will put on its glory. Or rather, that greater glory of which nature is the first sketch, For you must not think that I am putting forward any heathen fancy of being absorbed into nature. Nature is only the image, the symbol, but it is the symbol that Scripture invites me to use. So we're some to pass in through nature, beyond her, into that splendor which she fitfully reflects. So and in there, in beyond nature, we shall eat of the tree of life. So this finally reference to the rapture. He says the far faint off results of those energies which God's creative rapture implanted in matter when he made the worlds are what we now call physical pleasures. So even the physical pleasures that we feel, that stabbing of infinite joy, as he describes it in his fiction, Lewis, and even thus filtered, they are too much for our present management. Even those earthly senses of delights are too much for us to manage. But can you imagine the infinite joy which they connote and symbolize? What would it be to taste at the fountainhead that stream of which even those lower reaches prove so intoxicating? Yet that, I believe, is what lies before us. The whole man is to drink joy from the fountain of joy. St. Augustine said, the rapture of the saved soul will flow over into the glorified body. In the light of our present specialized and depraved appetites, we cannot imagine that this torrens voluptatis, and I warn everyone more seriously not to try, but it must be mentioned to drive our thoughts even more misleading things, thoughts that what is saved is a mere ghost, this body, this disembodied body, or that risen body lives in numb insensibility. The body was made for the Lord. And these dismal fancies are wide of the mark. So with all that said, we'll come to our conclusion here. He says, the cross comes before the crown, and tomorrow is a Monday morning. We come back to our habitual selves. A cleft has opened in the pitiless walls of the world, and we are invited to follow our great captain inside. The following him is, of course, the essential point. That point being so, it may be asked what practical use there is in the speculations which I've been indulging. I can think of at least one such use, and this is a fantastic point. It may be possible for each to think too much of his own potential glory hereafter. It is hardly possible for him to think too often or too deeply about that of his neighbor. How about my neighbor's glory? If that man, woman, or child was made for glory, for infinite glory, is that not something to think about? Rather than lionizing myself as a hero, rather than taking myself as a self-interpreting orphan that's going to write my own script for my life, tell it to others what a great man I am. How about thinking of my neighbor's glory? The load or weight or burden of my neighbor's glory should be laid on my back. A load so heavy that only humility can carry it. And the backs of the proud will be broken. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses. To remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you can talk to may one day be a creature which, if you say it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. They will be of the ultimate in either sense. They will be like God, or they will be so distant from God that they will be nothing short of the devil. All day long, we are in some degree helping each other in one or the other of these destinations. It is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities, as with the awe and the circumspection proper to them, that we should conduct all our dealings with one another, all friendships, all loves, all plays, all politics. There are no ordinary people. You've never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal. And their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. Now, in our day, there is a great movement amongst conservative Christians such as myself, those who want to preserve what is good and great about God and his glory in terms of culture. But ultimately, culture is less important than people. The culture is a reflection of people. If we see it in the right sense, we are, as educators, being servants to bring people into a glorious understanding of how God indwells all things and makes all things good. But we could make an idol of culture, our own culture, of any culture, of a foreign culture, of a past culture. What we really want to do, Lewis says, is we need to see those around us as something more than what they are, as God sees them, as God will know them. So he says, this does not mean that we are to be perpetually solemn. We must play. But our merriment must be of that kind, and it is, in fact, the merriest kind which exists between people who have, from the outset, taken each other seriously. No flippancy, no superiority, no presumption. And our charity must be a real and costly love, with deep feeling for the sins, in spite of which we love the sinner. No mere tolerance or indulgence which parodies love as flippancy parodies merriment. Next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. If he is your Christian neighbor, he is holy in almost the same way, for in him also Christ were vere latitat, the glorifier and the glorified. Glory himself is truly hidden. So those are the words with which he concludes this magnificent sermon, this essay, The Weight of Glory. I see it represented all over Lewis's fiction. It is shot through it, this sense of the importance of humility and of the posture. And we will see Edwin Ransom, who begins this, the philologist, go through this passage where he comes to know God even as he is known by God, and his name is Ransom, and it's not for no reason that his name is Ransom, but also he will become wounded, and he will suffer, and he will learn through his own journey, in some sense, to know what it is like to walk in the path of Christ. And with all of that, he will find himself in a company of others. And I'll talk more about membership and so forth, and transposition in talks on some of the other essays. But I wanted to talk about the weight of glory, which I think is the weight that anchors the whole of Lewis's corpus of works, and certainly pushes back against the disenchantment and alienation and sense of lostness on earth, which is expressed in the desire to leave the earth and go to the sky, which is presented as space and emptiness. I'll leave it at that and see you next time.